The tension in the courtroom was thick, the kind that made every breath feel heavy. Officer Greg Turner, a veteran cop with a reputation for being tough, some would say too tough, stood at the side of the room, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the people inside. He had always believed in order, in control, and in his mind, there were certain people who just didn't respect the law the way they should. And today, his patience was already running thin. At the center of the room, a young black woman, poised but clearly frustrated, stood by the defense table. Her name was Danielle Carter. She had been summoned here for reasons that should have been simple, a procedural issue, nothing major, but things never seemed to be simple when it came to her. She had learned that a long time ago. Greg watched as Danielle spoke firmly to the clerk, her voice calm but unwavering. He didn't like it. Something about her confidence irritated him, like she thought she was above the system he had spent his entire life enforcing. He stepped forward. "Hey, I need you to lower your voice and take a seat," he said, his tone firm. Danielle turned to him, her eyes steady. "Excuse me?" "I said take a seat," Greg repeated, his voice cold. People in the courtroom turned to watch, sensing the shift in energy. The air felt charged, heavy. "I'm handling my business," Danielle replied, her patience clearly wearing thin. Greg exhaled sharply. He had dealt with too many people like her, too defiant, too sure of themselves. He had no idea who she was, no clue that the woman standing before him was about to change his life forever. Before anyone could react, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip firm, his authority absolute. A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Danielle yanked her arm free, standing her ground. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice sharp. Greg's face twisted with irritation. "You're being disruptive. Either you cooperate or what?" Danielle cut in, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You gonna arrest me for standing in a courtroom?" Silence. The kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then, before Greg could respond, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a crisp suit stepped in, scanning the room before his eyes landed on Danielle. "Chief Carter," he called out. A beat of silence. Then another. Greg blinked. His grip on reality suddenly felt slippery. "Chief?" Danielle straightened her blazer, tilting her head slightly. "Yes," she responded coolly. Greg felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He looked around, expecting to see someone else, somebody, anybody, who fit the title better than the woman standing in front of him. But there was no mistake. Danielle Carter was his new boss. And he had just put his hands on her. The courtroom was still, the weight of realization pressing down on Greg's shoulders. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had spent years enforcing the law, making quick judgments about people before they even spoke. And now, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Danielle held his gaze, unreadable. "Is there a problem here, officer?" she asked, her voice measured but unmistakably firm. Greg's throat went dry. Before he could answer, the scene cut and shifted to a different moment, a different place. A crowded bus, the kind where seats were rare and personal space was non-existent. A teenage boy, maybe 16, sat near the front, his headphones tucked into his ears, his eyes half-focused on the world outside. He had just gotten out of school, his backpack still heavy on his lap. It had been a long day. All he wanted was to zone out, get home, and maybe escape into his music for a while. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed her. A woman, probably in her mid-30s, standing near the front, one hand gripping the metal rail, the other resting gently on her stomach. She was pregnant. The bus rattled over a pothole, making her shift slightly, gripping the pole tighter to steady herself. The boy didn't even think about it. Instinct took over. "Here," he said, pulling out his earbuds and standing up. "You can take my seat." The woman blinked, surprised. "Oh," she said, a small smile forming. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." She sat down carefully, sighing in relief. The weight off her feet was a blessing. The bus continued on, the boy now standing, holding onto the rail as he swayed with the movement of the vehicle. He wasn't looking for anything in return. He didn't need a thank you, didn't need recognition. It was just what you were supposed to do. But then, a few minutes later, he felt a gentle tug at his sleeve.
He turned.
The woman was holding out a small, folded piece of paper. He hesitated. "Take it," she said softly, her eyes kind. "Please." Curious, he took it, unfolding the paper with careful fingers. And what he read would change his life forever. Greg Turner felt his entire body tense up. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, his breath short and shallow. His mind scrambled to process what had just happened. Chief Carter, his new police chief. And he had just grabbed her like she was some random person causing trouble. The people in the courtroom were watching. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. The tension was unbearable. He had been in plenty of situations where he needed to take control, to make a split-second decision, but never like this. Never with stakes this high. Danielle Carter didn't break eye contact. She was calm, too calm. That made it worse. If she had yelled, if she had made a scene, maybe he could have played it off as a misunderstanding. But no. She just stood there, watching him, letting the weight of his mistake settle over him like a thick fog. "Is there a problem, Officer Turner?" she repeated, her voice controlled but sharp enough to cut. Greg swallowed hard. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice lower than usual. Danielle didn't answer right away. She simply studied him for a second longer, then adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and turned her attention back to the man who had entered. "Let's get this meeting started," she said. With that, she walked away.
Just like that.
Greg stood frozen for another few seconds before finally forcing himself to move. He clenched his jaw and took a slow breath, but the burning embarrassment didn't fade. He had always prided himself on being in control. And yet, in less than 5 minutes, he had lost it because he had let his own assumptions cloud his judgment.
And now?
Now he was at the mercy of a woman who had every reason to make his life miserable. Meanwhile, across town, the teenager on the bus stared at the note in his hand, his fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. The words on it didn't seem real. His heart pounded as he read them again, just to make sure he wasn't imagining things. "I've been looking for you." That was all it said. 5 words, written in neat, precise handwriting. He looked back at the woman. She wasn't staring at him, wasn't watching to see his reaction. She was just sitting there, gazing out the window as the bus rumbled along. He felt a chill run down his spine. Who was she? And what did she mean, "I've been looking for you"? For a moment, he thought about crumpling up the note and forgetting it ever happened. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she had meant to give it to someone else. But something told him that wasn't true. The bus came to a slow stop, and the woman stood up. He expected her to say something, to explain, to give him some kind of clue, but she didn't. She just met his eyes for the briefest second, then stepped off the bus and disappeared into the busy city street. He looked down at the note again. His palms felt sweaty now. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some random act of kindness that ended with a polite thank you. Something bigger was happening. Back at the police station, Greg walked in with a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. The precinct was busy as usual. Officers at their desks, phones ringing, paperwork stacking up, but for the first time in a long time, he felt completely out of place. He had spent years walking into this building with confidence, but now, he wasn't sure where he stood. Danielle Carter was in her new office. He could see her through the glass window, standing with her arms crossed, listening to another officer talk. She was already commanding the room, already making it clear that she was in charge. Greg clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding in the courtroom. This was about power. She had it now, and he didn't. He had worked under a lot of different leaders, some good, some bad. But none of them had ever made him feel this uncertain. He didn't know if Danielle was going to fire him, reprimand him, or just let him stew in his own guilt. And that was the worst part, waiting to see how bad this was going to get. And deep down, another thought gnawed at him, one he wasn't ready to face just yet. He had always believed he could read people. He thought he could tell who they were just by looking at them. But today, he had been wrong. And for the first time in his career, he was starting to wonder how many other times he had been wrong before. Elsewhere in the city, The teenager still held the note in his hand as he walked home, his mind racing. He didn't even notice the usual sounds of the neighborhood. The cars honking, kids shouting, music blasting from open windows. It all faded into the background as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that woman? How could she be looking for him? And, most importantly, why? He stepped onto the front porch of his house, still deep in thought, when he heard his mom's voice calling from inside. Malik, that you? He shook himself out of his thoughts and shoved the note into his pocket. Yeah, it's me, he called back, pushing open the door. His mom was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. She gave him a quick glance. You okay? You look like you saw a ghost. Malik forced a small smile. Nah, just a long day. She didn't push, just nodded. Dinner's almost ready. He muttered something about going to his room, then hurried upstairs. Once inside, he locked the door, pulled out the note again, and stared at it like it held all the answers. Something told him his life was about to change. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Greg Turner sat at his desk, staring at nothing. His hands rested on the edge, fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the wood. Around him, the precinct buzzed with the usual noise. Officers talking, keyboards clicking, the hum of police radio chatter in the background. But it all felt distant, like he was underwater, detached from everything. His mind was still stuck in that courtroom, in that moment when everything shifted. Danielle Carter was his new chief. He had grabbed her, dismissed her, treated her like she was nothing but a problem to control. And now, she was in the office just a few feet away, fully aware of what had happened. She hadn't said anything to him since, hadn't called him in, hadn't acknowledged him at all. And that was the worst part. If she had yelled, if she had embarrassed him in front of everyone, maybe he could have handled it. But she didn't. She just left him to sit with the weight of his own mistake. And the longer he sat with it, the heavier it got. He picked up a pen, twirling it between his fingers, his jaw tight. He needed to get ahead of this. He needed to talk to her, to clear the air before it got worse. Maybe if he explained himself. The office door opened. Danielle Carter stepped out, speaking with one of the senior officers. Her voice was steady, calm. She gave a few quick instructions, nodded, then turned slightly, just enough for her eyes to land on Greg. For a brief second, she held his gaze. Then she turned and walked away. Greg exhaled slowly, setting the pen down. This wasn't going to be easy. Across town, Malik sat on his bed, the note still clenched in his hand. He had read it at least 10 times, but it didn't change. The words stayed the same. I've been looking for you. It made no sense. He didn't know that woman. She wasn't a teacher, a neighbor, anyone he could remember seeing before. And yet, she acted like she knew him. Like she had been waiting for that exact moment to find him. His stomach twisted. It was probably nothing. Some weird mistake. He should just throw the note away and forget about it. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone and searched the words, "I've been looking for you" note on bus. Nothing useful came up. A bunch of random results, nothing that explained what had just happened. He sighed and tossed his phone onto the bed. His mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be. Downstairs, his mom called for him again. He stuffed the note into his pocket and headed down, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Greg finally made his move. He pushed his chair back and stood, adjusting his belt as he crossed the room toward the chief's office. His heart pounded harder than it should have. The door was cracked open. He knocked lightly. "Come in," Danielle's voice called. He stepped inside. She was behind the desk, skimming through a file, barely looking up. "Chief," he started, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I wanted to talk about earlier." She flipped a page, still not looking at him. "Earlier?" Greg clenched his jaw. She wasn't going to make this easy. "In the courtroom," he clarified. I didn't know who you were, and if I overstepped, that wasn't my intention." Danielle finally lifted her eyes. They were unreadable, calm but sharp. "You didn't overstep, Officer Turner," she said. "You grabbed me." Greg swallowed. "I was just trying to keep order." "Order?" Danielle repeated, leaning back slightly. "You thought I was out of order?" Greg shifted his weight. I thought you were escalating a situation. Danielle held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, as if she had just confirmed something to herself. Tell me something, Turner, she said. If I had been someone else, if I had looked a little different, if I had been wearing a uniform, would you have reacted the same way? Greg stiffened. He didn't answer right away. Danielle tilted her head. Think about it, she said, voice calm but firm. Because I have. Silence filled the space between them. Greg wanted to argue, to say it had nothing to do with anything other than keeping things in line. But the truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. I'll let you get back to work, Danielle said finally, dismissing him with a slight nod. Greg hesitated, then gave a stiff nod before turning to leave. But as he reached for the door handle, her voice stopped him. Oh, and Turner? He turned back. She met his eyes. Next time, be sure you know who you're dealing with before you put your hands on them. Greg swallowed hard. Then he walked out, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest like a stone. Across town, Malik sat at the dinner table, picking at his food. His mom noticed. You all right? She asked. He nodded, not looking up. But his mind was still on that note, on the woman who gave it to him, and the uneasy feeling that this was only the beginning. Greg Turner felt the weight of Chief Carter's words long after he had left her office. They stuck with him, looping in his head over and over. Would you have reacted the same way if I looked different? He wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to tell himself that his actions had nothing to do with who she was, just with what was happening at the time. But deep down, something gnawed at him. Something he wasn't ready to admit. For the first time in years, he questioned himself. His instincts, his judgment. Had he been acting on something buried deeper than he realized? Was it possible that he had been seeing people through a lens he never even knew he was wearing? The thought made him uncomfortable. That night, he sat in his car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel. The streets were quiet, the city's usual hum dulled by the late hour. He thought about going home, shutting everything out for a few hours. But instead, he found himself pulling out his phone and scrolling through the department's personnel records. He searched Danielle Carter's name. Her file came up. Her background was impressive. Years of service, commendations, a reputation for handling tough cases with precision. She had worked her way up, station by station, proving herself again and again. And now, she was his boss. Greg exhaled slowly. He had always believed in earning your place, in proving yourself. And she had. So, why had he doubted her the moment he saw her? His fingers hovered over the screen before he finally set the phone down, rubbing his face. Something about this whole situation felt bigger than just one bad moment in a courtroom. Meanwhile, across town, Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The note sat on his desk, its words still echoing in his head. He had spent the entire day thinking about it, about the woman, about what she could have possibly meant. And the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. He had thought about going back to the bus stop, waiting to see if she showed up again. But something about that felt dangerous. He didn't know why. He just knew that something about this wasn't normal. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. His fingers itched to grab the note again, but he forced himself to leave it alone. He needed to get some sleep. Maybe things would make more sense in the morning. But as he turned over, trying to block out his thoughts, a faint noise outside his window made his breath catch. A soft, deliberate sound, like footsteps on pavement. His heart pounded. Slowly, he sat up, staring at the window. Was someone out there? The streets outside his house weren't exactly quiet. Cars passed, people walked by, but this sound felt different. Closer. Malik held his breath, straining to listen. Silence. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe he was just paranoid because of the note, overthinking everything. But just as he was about to lay back down, the sound came again. This time, closer. A shadow flickered outside his window. His breath hitched. Someone was out there. Back at the precinct, Greg was still sitting in his car when his radio crackled to life. Turner, we got a situation, the voice on the other end said. Greg sat up, grabbing the radio. Go ahead. Disturbance reported near Oakwood. Possible break-in. Your closest. Greg didn't hesitate. On my way. He flicked on the engine, the hum of the car filling the silence. He was grateful for the distraction, for something to take his mind off everything else. As he sped toward the address, his focus shifted. Time to do his job. But as he got closer, something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be just another call. And he was right. Because the address? It was Malik Street. Greg's tires screeched slightly as he pulled onto Malik Street, his headlights cutting through the quiet darkness. His eyes scanned the row of houses, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what he was walking into, but something about this call didn't sit right. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, I'm on scene. No immediate signs of forced entry. I'm checking it out. Static buzzed before the response came. Copy that, Turner. Backup is on the way. Greg stepped out of his car, his hand resting near his holster, not drawing his weapon, just ready, just in case. The street was mostly empty, except for a few porch lights glowing faintly. Everything seemed normal. But then he saw it. A shadow near the side of a house. It moved quickly, disappearing behind the fence. Greg's instincts kicked in. He moved fast, stepping onto the sidewalk, his eyes locked on the spot where the figure had disappeared. Police, he called out. Come out where I can see you. Silence. Then footsteps. Running. Greg bolted after them. His boots pounded against the pavement as he cut through the yard, dodging trash cans and overgrown bushes. Whoever it was, they were fast, but Greg had been chasing people down for years. He knew when someone was running scared versus someone running with a plan. This person? They had a plan. Up ahead, the figure slipped into an alley. Greg pushed harder, cutting the distance between them. And then, just as he rounded the corner, nothing. The alley was empty. Greg slowed, his breath coming heavy, scanning every inch. There was no way they could have vanished that fast. No doors, no open windows, nowhere obvious to hide. And then his radio crackled again. Turner report. He pressed the button. Suspect fled. Lost visual. He swallowed his frustration, still looking around. Do we have an ID on the reporting party? A pause. Then dispatch answered. Call came from inside the residence. Greg froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. Inside? That meant. He turned on his heel, sprinting back toward the house. Meanwhile, inside, Malik pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering. He could still hear the footsteps outside, moving fast, fading, then coming back. And then a knock. Not a loud, banging one. A slow, deliberate one. His breath caught. This wasn't normal. Someone was outside his house. Someone who wasn't just passing by. His phone was on the desk across the room. Too far. The knock came again. His legs felt frozen, but somehow, he forced himself to move, creeping toward the window. He barely breathed as he peered through the blinds. And what he saw made his stomach drop. It wasn't just anyone. It was the woman from the bus. The woman who had given him the note. She was standing on his porch, looking calm. Like she had been waiting. Like she had always planned to be here. His pulse pounded in his ears. This didn't make sense. How did she know where he lived? She didn't knock again. She just waited. And then, as if she knew he was watching, she slowly lifted her hand, holding up another note. This one was folded neatly. And even though he couldn't read it yet, Malik knew whatever was written inside was about to change everything. Outside, Greg reached the house, drawing in a sharp breath. He moved quickly to the porch, spotting the figure standing there. He called out, "Hey, step away from the door." The woman turned, slowly. And the moment Greg saw her face, everything clicked. His stomach twisted. Because he knew exactly who she was. And he knew this wasn't a coincidence. This just got personal. Greg's pulse pounded as he locked eyes with the woman on Malik's porch. He hadn't seen her in years, but there was no mistaking who she was. Rachel Lawson. The last time he'd seen her, she was a confidential informant tangled up in one of the biggest cases of his career. She had disappeared before testifying, vanishing without a trace. Until now. Greg's hand hovered near his holster, but something in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't running. She wasn't scared. She was waiting. Malik stood frozen behind the window, watching everything unfold. He could see the tension between the two of them. The way the cop stared at the woman like he had seen a ghost. The way she barely moved, like she had expected this moment. Greg took a slow step forward. "Rachel, what the hell are you doing here?" She exhaled softly, then turned back to the door, lifting the folded note higher so Malik could see. "I need to talk to him." Greg clenched his jaw. "Not happening. Step away from the house." Rachel shook her head. "This isn't about you, Turner. It's about him." She tilted her head toward the window. "And what he deserves to know." Malik swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't understand what was happening, but the way she said those words made something inside him tighten. Like a puzzle piece clicking into place, even if he didn't know the full picture yet. Greg's radio crackled. "Turner, status update." He ignored it, his focus locked on Rachel. "You've got 5 seconds to explain before I take you in." Rachel finally turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "You should know by now, Greg. Some things don't go away just because you ignore them." She held the note out, not to Malik this time, but to Greg. He hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he took it and unfolded it with careful hands. His breath caught as he read the words. "I told you I've been looking for you. But the truth is, I've been looking for him, too." Greg's stomach dropped. He looked at Malik through the window, then back at Rachel. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." Rachel's lips pressed together, something sad in her eyes. "It is." Greg took a step back, his head spinning. Rachel looked at Malik, her voice quieter now. "You deserve the truth. And I couldn't stay away any longer." Malik's heart raced. "What truth?" Rachel exhaled slowly. "I'm your mother." Silence. Greg's world tilted. Malik's breath caught. And in that moment, everything they thought they knew changed forever. Malik felt like the world had just stopped moving. The woman standing in front of him, the stranger who had given him the note on the bus, the person who somehow knew where he lived, was now saying she was his mother. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. He stared at her, waiting for something to change, for her to take it back. But she didn't. She just stood there, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite read. Sadness. Regret. Hope. Greg was just as shaken. He looked between Rachel and Malik, his mind racing. He had known Rachel years ago. She had been caught up in a case in danger, and then she had disappeared. No one knew where she went. He had assumed she was dead, or that she had left to start over somewhere far away. But she had been here all along. Close enough to watch. Close enough to know who Malik was. Malik's voice came out barely above a whisper.
"No."
"That's not," he shook his head. "My mom, she's gone." Rachel swallowed. "I know what you've been told." She took a slow breath. "But the truth is, I had to leave. I had no choice." Greg stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Why now, Rachel? Why come back now?" Rachel didn't take her eyes off Malik. "Because he deserves to know. I never stopped watching over him, even when I couldn't be there." She hesitated, then looked at Greg. "And because he's in danger." Malik's stomach twisted. "What?" Rachel nodded toward the alley where the figure had disappeared earlier. "The person outside tonight wasn't some random break-in. They were looking for you, Malik. And I think I know why." Greg stiffened. "Who?" Rachel hesitated. "Someone from my past. From before I left." She turned back to Malik. "The people I was running from back then, they never really stopped looking. And now they know who you are." Malik could barely process what she was saying. His hands clenched at his sides. "So, what? You're saying my whole life was a lie? That my mom didn't really die, that you've been hiding, and now people are coming after me?" Rachel's face was full of pain. "I never wanted this for you." She took a shaky breath. "But I had to disappear. It was the only way to keep you safe. I didn't think they'd ever connect the dots. But something's changed. And if they know who you are, they won't stop." Greg's mind was already working through the possibilities. He had seen cases like this before. Old grudges never truly died. If Rachel had been involved with something dangerous back then, It was possible that someone had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. Greg turned to Malik. You need to come with me.
Now.
Malik stepped back. Come with you?
Where?
I don't even know what's real anymore. He turned to Rachel, his voice sharp. Why should I believe you? Rachel's face crumpled, but she didn't look away. Because I would never lie to you about this. I have nothing to gain from coming back except making sure you live. Greg's radio crackled again. Backup was arriving. The situation was escalating. Rachel tensed. I can't be here when they get here. Greg frowned. Rachel, if there's a real threat, you need protection too. Rachel shook her head. I've been running too long, Greg. You know what happens when people like me get put into the system. She turned back to Malik. But you still have a chance to live a normal life. Malik's chest felt tight.
How?
You just said people are coming after me. Greg exhaled. Which is why we need to handle this the right way. We can protect you. Both of you. Rachel hesitated. You don't know who you're dealing with, Greg. Greg's jaw tightened. I don't care. Malik isn't going to live in fear. He turned to the teen. I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either if I were you. But this is bigger than what happened in that courtroom. Bigger than my mistakes. Right now, the only thing that matters is keeping you safe. Malik's head was spinning, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay here. Not with people out there looking for him. Not with a past he didn't even know existed catching up to him. He nodded slowly. Okay. Rachel let out a shaky breath, relief and sadness flashing across her face. Greg's radio buzzed. Units on scene. Rachel took a step back. I have to go. Greg reached for her arm, but she pulled away. Please, she whispered. Let me do this my way. Greg clenched his teeth, but let her go. This isn't over. Rachel nodded. I know. She turned to Malik, her eyes filled with emotion. I wish I had more time. But if I can't be here, just know that I never stopped loving you. Malik's throat tightened. He had too many questions, too much left unsaid. But before he could speak, Rachel turned and disappeared into the night. Greg placed a firm hand on Malik's shoulder. Come on. Let's get you somewhere safe. Malik swallowed hard and nodded. As they walked toward the waiting squad car, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder one last time. Rachel was gone. But for the first time in his life, Malik knew the truth. And somehow, he knew this was only the beginning.